afternoon. Again, my name is Angie Halverson. I'm with Apt Associates, and I will be your moderator and facilitator for today's broadcast. Thank you for joining us today on our webinar, Behavioral Health Prescription Digital Therapeutics. We're excited to bring to you a very exciting technology in the behavioral health space. So let's get started. We're going to begin with a few admin notes. Before we begin, there are a few housekeeping items for today's webinar. We want to let you know that this will be recorded and will be made available on SAMHSA's website at a later date. We will provide participants with a PDF of the webinar PowerPoint slides. At this time, all lines are muted. If you do have questions for the presenter, please type them into the question box in the GoToWebinar panel on the right-hand side of your screen. We will address your questions in the Q&A portion of our presentation. During the webinar, we will have several interactive polls or surveys. We do encourage you to participate. It allows our presenter to get a sense of the participants and your background. At the end of the webinar, we will have a brief Q&A session in response to your written questions. We will also provide you with a brief survey. Today's webinar is titled Behavioral Health Prescription Digital Therapeutics. This webinar will be led by Dr. Yuri Maricic, MD, MBA from Pear Therapeutics. Dr. Maricic is Chief Medical Officer and Head of Clinical Development at Pear Therapeutics. He leads the clinical and regulatory team at Pear Therapeutics and manages and leads Pear's pipeline programs from concept through clinical development and regulatory submission. He leads the team for Pear's Reset clinical program team and strategies for the Reset substance use disorder digital therapeutics. He is leading the development of Reset-O for opioid use disorder. Dr. Maricic pioneered the first submission and granting of expedited access pathway breakthrough designation, recognizing its potential as a breakthrough and potentially life-saving therapeutic by the FDA. Dr. Maricic is a board-certified physician, investor, clinical developer, and strategist. Thank you, Dr. Maricic, for joining us today. I will now turn the webinar over to you.
Thanks, Angie, and thank you everyone for having me, and it's a real privilege and honor to have an opportunity to speak with you today. So as was mentioned, I will talk through a few goals and learning objectives and then move through the presentation. And at the end, I really would appreciate any questions that any of the attendees may have, as I always enjoy learning as much as possible from everyone what questions that we can help to continue to collaborate as we try and address these really important topics of behavioral health and needs that patients and public health may have. So today we're going to learn about behavioral health prescription digital therapeutics. We'll understand the process from discovery through clinical development and approval. We'll discuss and hopefully learn about the importance of partnerships as part of disseminating those innovations to patients. We'll learn about the pipeline at Pear Therapeutics of prescription digital therapeutics, and I'll even mention a little bit about others as this whole new modality of treatment is emerging. And then we'll review how Reset prescription digital therapeutic addresses patients with substance use disorder.
And as promised, welcome to our first poll. When thinking about the treatment of behavioral health problems such as substance abuse, which of the following best describes your opinion? The use of technology such as phone apps is interesting but not yet feasible. The use of technology such as phone apps is starting to mature. Technology is now being used as a part of the comprehensive treatment of substance use disorders. We're going to pause here briefly. Please take a moment and respond using the tools on your GoToMyWebinar screen in front of you. We will take about another 10 seconds. Please respond if you haven't had the chance yet.
This won't let me respond. Oh, organizers and panels don't vote.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for taking a moment to respond to our webinar. We will now close our poll. And it looks like about 62% of our respondents today indicate that the technology for substance use disorders is beginning to mature. Less so, 10% of you say that it's interesting but not yet feasible. And about a third of you indicate that it is now being used for comprehensive treatment of SUD. Thank you again for responding to our poll. I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Maricic.
Thanks, Angie. So an additional framing for the presentation is this abstract, which is that prescription digital therapeutics deliver evidence-based neurobehavioral and/or artificial intelligence-based interventions, either as monotherapy or combination therapy, thus representing a novel, clinically validated treatment option to improve outcomes. And just a little bit additional to that is that really the thesis of Pear and the thesis of prescription digital therapeutics is the scientific insight that particularly for diseases of the brain, and particularly for behavioral health diseases, which are a subset of diseases of the brain, that there's two primary treatment modes or modalities that we can use. The first is medication, which target particular neurocircuits and impact the synapses in those neurocircuits, modulating brain chemistry. The second is through experience, and this is typically delivered in a therapeutic context or in a clinical context as a neurobehavioral or behavioral intervention. And we also know from extensive research that's been done, many by individuals at SAMHSA, that when we combine those two modes of action, the medication as well as neurobehavioral intervention, that we will often observe improvements in outcomes better than either one alone. So there's a synergistic effect. And that is part of the thesis of Pear and of prescription digital therapeutics, and actually the genesis of the name, which is pairing medications plus software-based therapeutic interventions. But we thought it'd be more fun to spell it as a fruit rather than P-A-I-R. So what is the evidence base behind these therapeutics? And then how may they be implemented and integrated into clinical practices? So we'll address some of those questions as well. And then just as a disclosure, so I'm an employee of Pear Therapeutics, which is a developer of these prescription digital therapeutics. So as far as an agenda, we'll cover an executive summary. We'll then review the commercial products that Pear is working on, clinical product candidates that are in development, and then say a little bit about discovery and platform. So many diseases, particularly CNS, neuropsychiatric, and neurophysiologic, are inadequately treated or addressed. In my view, CNS is one of the last frontiers that still has an enormous distance to go in terms of providing what patients need. Pharmacotherapy interventions have high failure rates and are often limited to a single mechanism of action, whereas prescription digital therapeutics leverage the insights around behavior, leverage the insight around neurobehavioral interventions, and have the opportunity to transform healthcare and redefine standard of care across more than 50+ disease areas. Pear Therapeutics and digital therapeutics as a modality are following what we call the therapeutics model, which is based on the premise that a therapeutic of any form should, one, after being developed based on valid scientific data and an evidence base, demonstrate strong efficacy and safety data assessed via randomized clinical trials. It should be held to the same standard and level of rigor in terms of clinical data as we would expect of any medication that might be prescribed to us or any medical device that might be used. Just because it's software, it should not have applied any lower bar. Second is that regulatory approval with labeled medical claims for efficacy in treatment of disease. So there should, in other words, be a third party that reviews the data in a rigorous fashion and then provides clarity to all the key stakeholders. That includes patients, that includes healthcare providers, and that includes payers. On the back end of receiving regulatory review and ultimately market authorization with a labeled claim, the therapeutic is conveyed what's called a product code. And this enables standardized reimbursement by payers. And so this is another important aspect of the therapeutics model that helps to fuel access, which is that we're not asking patients to pay for these products. We're not asking providers to pay for these products. We are taking these products to insurance companies, be they public or private, and asking them to review the data and the medical value created in order to have reimbursement that is aligned with the entire health system and with taxpayer-funded healthcare and individual-funded healthcare. So the therapeutics model aligns patients, it aligns providers, and it aligns payers. So in September of 2017, the FDA cleared the first ever prescription digital therapeutic to treat disease. There have been other pieces of software that have been evaluated and cleared by the FDA. There had been other mobile applications that had been cleared by the FDA, but these were either for decision support or for providing support or other aspects, but were not actually therapeutic. And so what is momentous about this event was that the FDA for the first time reviewed and acknowledged that software could treat disease and improve outcomes and actually provide a label just like any other medication that speaks to the intended use, the indications for that use, and how it should be used in terms of integrating into standard of care. And so that as we move forward, in addition to hopefully bringing additional therapeutic to patients, we must refine how these new therapeutic options are disseminated, how they're implemented and integrated into clinical practice while generating real-world experience and real-world data for continued optimization. So taking a step back, prescription digital therapeutics are a truly novel and sea-changing therapeutic class with large potential to impact disease. When we look at the history of bringing additional types of treatment to patients, there was initially small molecules. Eventually, there was the opportunity to do biologics, which are large, generally protein-based molecules that have different mechanisms of delivery. We've recently seen the advent of cell and gene-based therapies, and now we have digital therapeutics as well. But other than the fact that there's software, they are treated just like drugs. So they're software drugs, they're targeted at serious diseases with high unmet medical need. We hold them to the same bar as a drug, so drug-like safety, drug-like clinical efficacy and labeled claims. And we pursue a drug-like reimbursement pathway that's reflecting the health economic value or medical value created by these products when integrated into standard of care. So how does this fit? What is the cycle? So PDTs, or prescription digital therapeutics, are developed, approved, prescribed, and reimbursed via this traditional model. You'll have pharmaceuticals with efficacy claims to treat disease, and there's software with efficacy claims to treat disease. And when we bring these together, a patient is diagnosed and then the product is prescribed. They are then reimbursed via a pharmacy or medical benefit. They are dispensed via a specialty pharmacy or what we call a hub or patient service center. And then the patient uses the therapeutic according to indications for use and follows up with the clinician and the clinical care team. So other than being software, they are integrated and used by the patient just the way anything else like a traditional drug or medical device is used. So Pear has been one of several companies that are leading this wave of innovation. There's several other companies that we continue to collaborate with that are also working similarly. So one company that I want to mention is Akili Interactive, and they are developing prescription digital therapeutics for patients with ADHD and just actually demonstrated some really exciting data in showing improvement in outcomes. And so I think it's important to recognize that this is a early and emerging field, but it's a field where we are now going to start seeing in 2018 and particularly in 2019 extensive use by patients and their providers in clinics around the world. So the first ever prescription digital therapeutic with FDA market authorization was the second half of 2017, which was Reset for patients with substance use disorder. We at Pear are now tracking toward our second prescription digital therapeutic with FDA market authorization expected in the second half of this year for a therapeutic called Reset-O, which is focused on patients with opioid use disorder, and the FDA conveyed breakthrough designation to that therapeutic in the second half of 2017 as well. And then we have a third prescription digital therapeutic that is targeting market authorization in 2019, 2020, and we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. We have multiple discovery, clinical, and commercial stage partnerships with pharma, and we'll talk a little bit more about why we think that that's a helpful model for how we disseminate these to patients and providers. And we have development stage PDTs and a discovery platform that's working on more than 50 indications to target. So this is the platform and the pipeline at Pear. So as you can see on the left is the name of the product. There is then to the right column of that, the therapeutic area. And then as we advance these therapeutics, they move through stages. So discovery being the stage where we're initially developing the clinical content, really understanding the patient and the patient population and mapping the clinical workflow and developing the mechanisms of action that will target the biology within that disease. We then move, once we progress from there, to proof of concept, where we are focused on demonstrating in randomized clinical trials that this therapeutic does improve meaningful outcomes. And these are not novel outcomes that we are inventing, but rather outcomes that are quote unquote FDA approvable outcomes that the FDA would use for any other drug or device. We'll then meet with the FDA to get their feedback and then engage in pivotal studies, which are typically larger registrational studies that will support submission of that data to the FDA to request review, evaluation, and ultimately FDA market authorization. And on the right, you can see columns. So we partnered with a number of academics as well as commercial partners to support dissemination. And so as we move down the therapeutic areas and the products, you can see Reset, which is focused on substance use disorder. And that is the first product that received market authorization from the FDA with labeled claims to improve abstinence and retention. Reset-O, which is focused on patients with opioid use disorder, is intended to be used in combination with buprenorphine to improve abstinence and retention. Pear 003, which is a therapeutic focused on patients with both chronic insomnia and depression, and has been shown in multiple large studies to improve outcomes in chronic insomnia, depression, and anxiety. And then the next one I'll mention before moving forward is we have a therapeutic called Thrive, which is focused on patients with schizophrenia and is intended to be used in combination with atypical antipsychotics. So let's talk a little bit more about reset and reset-o.
Thank you, Dr. Marisich, and that brings us to our next poll question. When thinking about using technology in substance abuse treatment, with which of the following do you agree? I am not yet comfortable using technology in substance use disorder treatment. I would be somewhat comfortable using technology if I knew more about how it works. I would be comfortable using technology if there was research showing that it was effective. Please take a moment and vote using the tools on your GoToWebinar toolbar. And we will leave our poll open for just a few more seconds. If you haven't voted, please take this time now to do so. All right, thank you very much for voting. We will close our poll now and we'll take a look at our results. So the majority of you indicate that you would be comfortable if research demonstrated efficacy. The least, obviously, there is I'm not comfortable using technology in substance use disorder treatment. And then in the midline there, about 30% of you, slightly less than a third of you, would be comfortable if you knew more about how it works. Thank you again for taking time to vote in our poll, and let's hear more from Dr. Marisich. Dr. Marisich?
Thank you, Angie. So as many of you are well aware, we are facing in this country a large challenge in patients struggling with SUD and OUD, which have reached epidemic proportions, with greater than 21 million Americans currently suffering from SUD or OUD and associated economic impact exceeding over $500 billion annually. However, current care for SUD and OUD is insufficient. One is that only a small portion of patients receive treatment each year. There is also a limited number of providers available to treat patients. And the Affordable Care Act, while requiring insurers to cover SUD and OUD treatment, has limited access to care in many ways as the primary reason patients do not receive care. However, prescription digital therapeutics such as Reset and reset-o have an enormous potential to improve outcomes. One, because they deliver real-time evidence-based mechanism of action on neurobehavioral intervention that can be used in the context of clinical care with their clinician. Two, because of this, they increase access. They help improve the quality of care, and they have data demonstrating an improvement in outcomes in addition to standard of care treatment. So let's talk a little bit more about Reset. So Reset is a prescription digital therapeutic which delivers three mechanisms of action. The first is an addiction-specific form of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is called CRA, or the Community Reinforcement Approach. There is a second mechanism of action, which is fluency training, and a third, which is contingency management for patients with substance use disorder. And these mechanisms of action have been validated to improve outcomes when delivered face-to-face. But what we've discovered is that as we digitize those portions that lend themselves to the more repetitive or rote aspects, we see both an improvement in outcomes because of the repeatability and quality of care, but we also see that this helps to extend clinicians because it allows the clinician to focus on the more non-repetitive and non-linear higher cognitive aspects of clinical care to support the patient. The indications for Reset is as a prescription digital monotherapy with labeled claims to increase both retention in treatment and abstinence from the patient's substance of abuse in patients with substance use disorder. There is a prescription duration of 12 weeks because that was the length of the study. There are 2 randomized clinical trials demonstrating safety and efficacy in over 1,000 patients with SUD, and these are patients with use of alcohol, cannabis, cocaine, and/or stimulants. And in those studies, we found, very interestingly, a dose-response relationship that was demonstrated. In other words, the more the patient used the product, which was defined as module completion, which are the increments of the treatment, the more likely was a patient to be abstinent, and the more likely was a patient to be retained in treatment. So Reset is the first ever PDT to achieve FDA market authorization with medical claims to treat disease. And commercially, there is now a reimbursement code or unique device identifier that's issued to support payer reimbursement. We have payer coverage discussions ongoing, and we partnered with Novartis and Sandoz to help disseminate Reset to patients and their healthcare providers in the second half of this year. So let's talk a little bit more about the pivotal study that supported the FDA's review and market authorization of Reset. So in this pivotal study, there were 399 patients with SUD, and this was due to alcohol, cannabis, cocaine, or stimulants. And these patients received either treatment as usual, which was intensive face-to-face therapy. Many of them were similar to intensive outpatient treatment or IOT or IOP programs, versus they were randomized to reduce treatment as usual plus Reset for 12 weeks. Patients in the study had to provide urine samples twice per week, as well as breathalyzer to objectively monitor their abstinence in addition to self-report. And the co-primary study endpoints was 1, abstinence in weeks 9 through 12, and 2, retention in treatment. And we'll look at this data in more detail, but the primary top line data is presented to the right. So you can see in the top row abstinence for the SUD 399 patient population, that for those randomized to Reset, 40.3% were abstinent at the last 4 weeks of the study. So in other words, a patient had to have all 8 of their urine drug screens be negative. If a single one was positive, then they were considered a treatment failure in the statistical analysis, compared to treatment as usual. So there was a more than doubling of abstinence, and this was statistically as well as clinically significant, and really impressive numbers when you consider that this is not a medication, but this is a digital therapeutic. The second was we also looked at patients who are refractory. So it is understood in SUD and OUD that patients who show up on their first day of treatment and have a positive urine drug screen do not do well. These are patients who tend to struggle. And you can see this because in this column here, the TAU arm, or treatment as usual, had only 3.2% of these patients abstinent at the end of the 12-week study. However, patients who are randomized to Reset demonstrated a 5-fold increase to 16.1%, and this was statistically significant. And then lastly, in terms of retention, so we know that patients who stay in treatment longer is predictive of improved outcomes long-term. And so this is a very important endpoint, and actually an endpoint that we hear both from providers and payers is as equally important as abstinence, if not more so. And what we found in the pivotal study was that Reset increased the likelihood of patients staying in treatment or retained in treatment relative to treatment as usual, and this was statistically significant. And the nomogram here below shows the improvement in abstinence rate, so standard of care patients who 40.3% when those who are randomized to Reset, compared to 17.6% in treatment as usual. And then the non-abstinent study start is the refractory patients. So let's talk a little bit more about this study. So in this pivotal clinical study, this was run through the NIDA clinical trial network, and was evaluating RESET, which at the time was called Therapeutic Education System, which is the academic name and version of RESET, as part of a community-based outpatient substance abuse treatment. And in fact, there'd already been a number of clinical trials that had been run evaluating RESET and RESET-O, again, academic name TES, in patients with opioid use disorder. And so the clinical question that investigators at NIDA asked was, how can we evaluate this in an all-comer patient population? And so that was the clinical question that supported this trial. So going into this trial, they decided to recruit 507 patients with substance use disorder related to opioids, cannabis, alcohol, stimulants, and/or cocaine. And these patients were enrolled and randomized to receive, as we mentioned earlier, treatment as usual, which is standard treatment offered and prescribed as usual in outpatient substance abuse treatment program. And this was consisting of 4 to 6 hours per week of face-to-face treatment. However, patients were also randomized to a substitution of 2 hours per week of standard face-to-face treatment as well as RESET. So if you were in the treatment as usual arm, you got 4 to 6 hours of face-to-face treatment. If you were randomized to the intervention or RESET arm, you received 2 hours less of face-to-face treatment. As far as endpoints, as mentioned earlier, patients visited the clinic twice per week for a urine drug screen and breath alcohol screen to monitor for reduced substance use. And this was measured by both the self-report and then confirmed by objective toxicology. And then for retention and treatment as the co-primary endpoint, we evaluated time from last face-to-face treatment. So a little bit more about the inclusion criteria. So these were all patients who were actively using. One, it was in patients, men and women, 18 years of age and older, who were accepted for outpatient substance abuse treatment. They had to self-report any substance use problem, including alcohol. But if they reported use of alcohol, they also had to report an additional substance. So there were, in this study, no alcohol use disorder only patients. They had to have alcohol plus another substance. And that was trying to control for the severity of addiction. Additionally, patients had to report use of a drug of abuse within 30 days prior to screening, or to have exited a controlled environment within 30 days of screening and report use of a drug of abuse within 60 days prior to screening. So in other words, patients had to be actively struggling with use. They could not have been a patient who was already in recovery or had achieved longer term abstinence. As far as exclusion criteria, the patient had to be able to read the modules in English. They had to be able to, of course, provide informed consent. They had to be within the area within the next 3 months so that they could complete the study. And we'll talk a little bit more about this one, they were not allowed to be receiving opioid replacement medication. And this gets to the fact that at the time the study was being designed, there had actually already been 3 randomized clinical trials showing that RESET-O improved abstinence and retention in patients with opioid use disorder in combination with pharmacotherapy, 2 in combination with buprenorphine, 1 in combination with methadone. And so when the team was designing this study, there was concern that if a subportion or subpopulation of the patients in the study were receiving either methadone or buprenorphine, that this could be a confounder. And so patients who were on medication-assisted treatment were in fact excluded from this study. If we move over to the right, we will see the breakdown of substances here. So the light green is the primary substance of abuse, which was subjectively reported by the patient at the beginning of the study. When they entered, they were asked by the research team what was the primary substance of abuse that caused the patient the most problems, and then they reported other substances. And so you can see there was roughly 20% for each primary substance of abuse. So cannabis, opioids, alcohol, cocaine, stimulants, and other. However, there was a significant amount of other substances, which you can see as well, alcohol here was considerably used. In total, 91% of the patients in the study were polysubstance users or used more than one substance of abuse. So on the left is the patient flow, and on the right is the normogram that we reviewed before. So the patient flow here shows the number of patients who were eligible to screen, the number who were eligible after screen, the number who completed informed consent, and then 507 who are randomized. And so you can see 255 are randomized to reset, 252 to treatment as usual. But as I mentioned earlier, that in that patient population, those patients who were reporting use of opioids were not allowed to be enrolled in the study if they were also receiving medication-assisted treatment. In other words, this subset of patients, there was 108 of them who were using opioids as a substance of abuse or a primary substance of abuse, but also who were not receiving standard of care medication-assisted treatment. However, we analyzed that patient population and we called that the all-comer patient population. We looked at abstinence weeks 9 through 12. We saw an odds ratio of 2.2, so there was these patients were twice as likely to be abstinent. This was statistically significant. And the percentage, while not shown in the normogram above, was that patients randomized to reset was 29% were abstinent, compared to 16% in the treatment as usual. So there's a very dramatic improvement in abstinence in that 507 patient population with 255 randomized to reset. However, we also looked at the standard of care group, and this is the group of patients who are all receiving standard of care. In other words, we analyzed this cohort by removing those 108 patients who said their primary substance of abuse were opioids, but they were not receiving medication-assisted treatment. And we know from prior studies that when you combine reset-O to medication-assisted treatment, that there was an improvement in abstinence and retention. And so you can see in this cohort, it was reset plus standard of care, 206 patients compared to 193 in treatment as usual. There was an odds ratio of 3.17. This was statistically significant, and this is represented in the normogram above with the percentage rate on the y-axis, treatment as usual, 17.6%, and a more than doubling of 40.3% in the reset arm. And then, as mentioned earlier, we also looked at patients who were defined as refractory or non-abstinent at study start. There was 101 patients who were randomized to reset versus 91 in treatment as usual. And you can see here weeks 9 through 12, 5.74 odds ratio, statistically significant, and so a more than fivefold increase in abstinence. So again, really impressive numbers from a digital therapeutic. So while we looked at weeks 9 through 12, or the last 4 weeks, and the patient had to have all 8 of their urine drug screens be negative, and that is NIDA's recommendation for how to evaluate abstinence at the end of a study as a very important clinically meaningful endpoint. We also looked at abstinence in several other ways. So in the all-comer patient population, which if you recall from the prior slide, there was the 507 patients. That includes patients who were primary substance of opioids but were not receiving MAT. And in this patient population, we looked at what is called consecutive abstinence. And so consecutive abstinence is the number of half weeks in a row, and what was the mean half weeks in a row or average half weeks in a row. And we found that this was statistically significant in terms of improvement, as well as we looked at what is called total abstinence. So this is adding up all of the half weeks over the course of the trial, and then looking at the mean standard deviation and statistical significance. And we also found that in the abstinence half weeks, there was an improvement in the all-comer population. In the standard of care arm, or in reset's label, in those patients, when we looked at that cohort, we similarly found statistically significant improvement in consecutive abstinent half weeks, as well as total abstinent half weeks. So regardless of how we looked at abstinence across both cohorts, we found improvement that was statistically and clinically significant. So we also mentioned earlier that we looked at retention, and this is a Kaplan-Meier curve evaluating patient dropout or retention in treatment. And so the y-axis is the percentage of patient remaining in treatment. Green is patients randomized to reset. Gray is patients randomized to treatment as usual. And what we observed here was that patients who were randomized to reset were more likely to remain in treatment. And this was statistically significant, and this is an important endpoint because it predicts long-term treatment outcomes. And then at the beginning of talking about reset, we also discussed reset shows high rates of patient engagement and enhances treatment retention versus face-to-face therapy. And what we observed was that, one, there was really high levels of engagement of the participants using reset. So 74% of all participants who were assigned to reset actually finished what are called the core modules, which we'll talk more about during the 12-week period. Furthermore, 74.1% of participants who finished the core modules were abstinent at weeks 9 through 12. And then on average, after completing the core modules, which build on each other, participants went on to complete an additional 11 optional or supplemental modules. And then we analyzed what was the relationship between abstinence and modules completed, as well as retention and modules completed. We only have a slide here for abstinence, but we recently presented at a poster at the American Psychiatric Association both the abstinence and retention dose response. So on the left in this table, you can see the number of modules completed in groups of 10, and what we observed was that as patients completed more modules, they were more likely to have negative urine drug screens, and this was statistically significant. We also looked at module completion and found that the average number of modules completed per week, that the more modules a patient completed, the more likely they were to be abstinent, with abstinent being the solid green line and the hashed line being non-abstinent. And it's important to note here that patients were recommended to complete 4 modules per week. And then if we go to the graph below, if we look at the average time spent on modules in minutes, that patients who spent more time on modules were more likely to be abstinent, which is what we termed module retention. So again, we found patients were really engaged in actually completing their modules. They completed a high portion of them, and that those completion were associated with higher abstinence. So in addition, we also asked both the patients and the providers how using the system was. What was their satisfaction? And while I won't go through all of these, we found that in general, patients scored between a 70 and 80% on satisfaction and ratings of utility. We found similar scores for providers, but in general, we found that patients enjoyed using this, and we know that many patients can be very difficult for them to get to face-to-face meetings, and so this was a feedback that was very important. Maybe one more thing before I'll talk a little bit about the label and indications for use, and we don't have a slide here, but interestingly, we found that when patients who were randomized to reset actually went to more of their face-to-face appointments. So you might think that patients who were given the option of a prescription digital therapeutic would go to less face-to-face, but instead we found the opposite, which is that patients who were randomized to reset were more engaged in their treatment, and they showed up to a higher proportion of their face-to-face appointments. So in the indications for use received from the FDA, this is the label that the FDA administered to reset after evaluating the clinical data and the product and looking at both safety and efficacy. So they said in the indications for use, 1, reset is intended to provide cognitive behavioral therapy as an adjunct to contingency management for patients 18 years of age and older who are currently enrolled in outpatient treatment under the supervision of a clinician. And we think this is really important, that reset is not designed to replace a clinician. It is rather an extension of the clinician, and that clinical care from both an individual as well as a team is critically important. And then reset is indicated as a 12-week or 90-day prescription-only treatment for patients with substance use disorder. So there's a broad patient population, in other words, patients with multiple types, including cocaine, cannabis, alcohol, etc. There are several exceptions based on the inclusion-exclusion criteria in the clinical trial that was used to support submission to the FDA. So one is that patients who are not currently on opioid replacement therapy or medication-assisted treatment, who abuse alcohol solely, or whose primary substance of abuse is opioids. Reset is intended to, one, increase abstinence from patient substance of abuse during treatment. So that is the first claim based on the clinical data we reviewed. And two is increased retention in the outpatient treatment program. As far as classification, so Reset was given what's called a class 2 with special controls, which means that it is a moderate risk device, and that for subsequent devices to reference the predicate of Reset, they must similarly demonstrate clinical data showing safety and efficacy. And then because this was a novel treatment paradigm that was submitted to the FDA, there is a new classification schema and classification language that describes Reset and subsequent devices within this class. And so that language is here. And all this is posted on the FDA website under Reset. So by now, I'm sure many of you are asking, well, what is Reset? Okay, we talked a lot about the data, but how does this therapeutic actually work? So like many of our prescription digital therapeutics, Reset has a patient-facing therapeutic application on the left here, and then a clinician-facing dashboard. And so to get to this point, a patient is, one, identified and diagnosed, given a prescription access code. They have this inputted in support with the hub and patient services center and their clinical care team, and then they get access to Reset. And there is a home screen and cognitive behavioral therapy modules that the patient completes in a guided path. And then there is something called fluency training. So as they complete their treatment, the patient at the end completes assessments that evaluate proficiency as well as reinforcing concept mastery. When they complete a module successfully, or when they have a negative urine drug screen entered by the clinician into the dashboard, they get to spin a wheel of contingency management. Contingency management is an evidence-based behavioral intervention. It's used in many different diseases and is found to be very effective in substance use disorder. And so the patient spins the wheel. There's an algorithm that predicts, and roughly half the time the patient gets a congratulatory message, but half the time they get a small monetary reward that is administered in the form of a gift card. And there's both the random aspect of this, but also the reinforcing aspect that this helps to compete with the dopamine response that a patient would normally get with using a substance of abuse, but rather is now receiving to positively reinforce completing treatment as well as having negative urine drug screen. As part of the patient-facing application, there are also assessments. The patient can spontaneously fill out craving and trigger assessment, as well as a mobile dashboard. And then there is every 4 days a pushed assessment called a timeline follow back or self-report, where the patient provides information as to their use over the last 4 days, as well as the patient's cravings and triggers. And all this information is shared over here with the clinician on their dashboard so that they can monitor their progress in terms of module use. They can look at cravings and triggers to identify patterns to support their overall evaluation decision making. They can look at the patient's concept proficiency. And what we have learned from providers is that this information is really helpful because it helps them to focus on those areas where the patient is struggling and let the patient to self-complete those areas that are more repetitive, that they are obtaining proficiency. And then lastly, the clinician can review the patient's abstinence from urine drug screen, self-report, and their compliance with showing up for their appointment. So all this information is shared with the clinician, the clinical care team, and can be used to help improve treatment. And when we have Q&A, I'd be happy to take additional questions about the therapeutic. Just one more thing on the modules is that there are actually a number of modules. So in Reset, there are 61 modules. In Reset-O, there are 67 modules, and these are broken up to build on each other and include everything from how to have drug refusal, problem solving, functional analysis, and provide patients with the tools to support them in decreasing their use of a substance, eventually discontinuing their use of substance, and then helping to build a skill set that will support their long-term recovery. So these are just a few images of some of the additional tracking features, such as the assessment. So I mentioned there's a push assessment every 4 days. So you can see here, have you taken any drugs in the last 4 days? Yes or no? Which days did you use? Then it asks the patients on how many of the past 4 days have you had an urge, desire, craving for any drug or alcohol? And then the patient can report their status spontaneously. So this is a spontaneous assessment, or report your status, and the patient inputs their use, their cravings, as well as triggers affecting this craving. And the patient can also view their own inputted assessment. So let's talk about Reset-O. So Reset-O is tracking to be the first FDA authorized drug software combination, which delivers, again, addiction-specific form of cognitive behavioral therapy, fluency training, and contingency management for patients with opioid use disorder. It is intended to be used in combination with buprenorphine to treat OUD, to improve abstinence and retention in patients with OUD, and a 12-week prescription duration. There have been 3 randomized clinical trials in over 450 patients demonstrating safety and efficacy. 2 were in combination with buprenorphine. 1 was in combination with methadone. Reset-O is currently an investigational device, so it is under review by the FDA. And the first the first prescription digital therapeutic to receive breakthrough designation. And while under review, we're expecting market authorization expected in the second half of 2018. And commercially, we're actually in discussions around incorporating buprenorphine into prescribing regulations, as well as working with Sandoz to launch and disseminate to patients upon receiving market authorization from the FDA. So this is just showing on the left the letter and our press release about Pear receiving expedited access pathway for Reset-O, which is now called breakthrough status. And this just illustrates that Reset-O is similar to Reset in many ways, but has both added content and features specific to opioid dependence. So Reset-O includes additional supplemental modules that are focused on opioid use disorder. And it also has a buprenorphine function that provides things like reminders and assessments of the patient's use, non-use, or other aspects of using buprenorphine. This is a summary of the three randomized clinical trials that I mentioned, so 2 with buprenorphine and 1 with methadone. In these studies, patients received standard of care treatment, so both arms received the medication, and then patients in the intervention arm were randomized to Reset-O, and urine drug screen was used to assess abstinence. And so you can see percent weeks opioid abstinence was increased in Reset-O compared to in-office therapy, which included medication-assisted treatment. And the mean weeks of continuous opioid abstinence was increased in Reset-O, while there was reduced therapist contact time needed. But again, therapist contact time is important. It was just that it was a clinician extension design for those studies. So in the Reset-O pivotal study design that was submitted to the FDA, you can see this on the left, so number of consented participants, enrolled participants, randomization, and then patients assigned to Reset or treatment as usual. And on the left are the reasons for patients who were excluded or did not participate in the study. And on the left here is just a summary overall of that study design. So 170 patients with OUD who were receiving buprenorphine, so both arms, and then patients were randomized to Reset-O plus buprenorphine or treatment as usual plus buprenorphine for 12 weeks. Patients were provided urine samples 3 times per week to objectively monitor abstinence, and then co-primary endpoint analysis, abstinence in weeks 9 through 12 and retention and treatment. And you can see this as well, top line abstinence from opioids on the right, so 75.9% in reset-O compared to 60.6% in treatment as usual. The odds ratio is 2, which greater than 2, which means that there was a doubling of likelihood to be abstinent, and the p-value was statistically significant at 0.02. And then retention also showed improvements, so 82.4% in reset-O, 68.4% in treatment as usual. That was statistically significant. And below here's a normogram of total abstinence in terms of 1/3 weeks versus abstinence weeks 9 through 12 at the last 4 weeks of the study. And again, for patients who would have been randomized to reset-O as well as treatment as usual, abstinence was defined as basically having all of their urine drug screens during those last 4 weeks be negative. And then this is the Kaplan-Meier curve for reset-O. So on the y-axis is proportion of patients remaining in treatment. Red is patients randomized to reset-O, and blue is treatment as usual. And so you can see there was also here a statistically significant improvement in retention. So this is just a high-level overview of how prescription is generated, how the prescription is then executed on. Once the provider prescribes reset, it goes through a hub, which takes care of the fulfillment and also takes care of the prescription adjudication and fulfillment, and then also data sharing as well. So the goal of the service aspect is to make this as easy and lightweight as possible for the healthcare provider or clinician. And then part of the hub or Pear Connect is this customer service center. And so it provides support around clinical, pharmacy, patient management, reimbursement, as well as technical support and troubleshooting in the onboarding and use phase. So all the aspects of a traditional therapeutic are provided here for patients using reset or reset-O. And this just describes a little bit more about how the hub and specialty pharmacy address reimbursement and support the needs of the healthcare provider to limit the burden and needs of and support the needs of the healthcare provider when they're working with insurance and pharmacy to support fulfillment.
Great, fascinating stuff, Dr. Maricic. Thank you so much. This brings us to our third poll. Now that you have learned about behavioral health prescription digital therapeutics, with which of the following do you agree? I do not think that prescription digital therapeutics has a place in our program. I am not certain if prescription digital therapeutics could be useful in our program. Or I think that prescription digital therapeutics could be a useful component in our program. We'll pause here for just a brief moment while you vote in your GoToWebinar panel. And we will close our poll in just a couple of seconds. Last chance to vote on our final poll. Wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time to vote. We will close our poll now. We will take a look at our results. Clearly, the majority of you have heard Dr. Marisic's presentation and have found that there is incredible value in the work that he is doing here with Pear Therapeutics. 76% of you think that it would be a useful component to your program. Thank you very much. I appreciate you taking the time to vote in our poll, and I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Maricic for section 3 of his presentation.
Thank you, Angie. And again, we'll appreciate any questions in the Q&A period. We'll move, I think, more expeditiously through the clinical product candidates. Just to give some additional context of what are the opportunities around future therapeutics. So Pear 003 is a prescription digital therapeutic to treat insomnia and depression. It delivers insomnia-specific CBT and cognitive restructuring to improve insomnia and depressive symptoms. It is designed as a monotherapy, so to be used alone, not in combination with a drug, with proposed claims to improve insomnia and symptoms of depression in patients with chronic insomnia. There have been 9 RCTs involving over 3,000 patients with pivotal data demonstrating a durable treatment effect through 6 months. And there's numerous additional studies in a range of diseases that have both insomnia and other comorbid disorders like oncology, diabetes, depression, asthma, etc. The FDA pre-sub or pre-NDA meeting is anticipated for the second half of this year, and the 510(k) submission expected in early 2019. So this is a summary of the pivotal data. So the pivotal study overview is of 1,149 patients with depression and insomnia randomized to receive either Pear 003 or placebo digital content for 6 weeks. Top-line results demonstrated significant improvement in depression symptoms, greater than 50% reduction, insomnia symptoms, greater than 50% reduction, anxiety symptoms as well. And so you can see the primary endpoints were here. For depression, we used PHQ-9, and this shows the score at baseline in patients, as well as at 6 weeks on treatment and 6 months after treatment, and the statistical improvement. And then down here in the normogram below is the comparison between the active control, which was a sham active psychoeducation, relative to green being for patients with Pear 003. And so you can see there's statistically significant improvement in depression, in insomnia, and anxiety. We also have a therapeutic called Thrive, which is the first multimodal therapy treating patients with schizophrenia. It is intended to be used in combination with atypical antipsychotics. And similarly, there's a patient-facing application as well as a clinician dashboard that is intended to be used to treat patients and improve outcomes in symptoms of patients with schizophrenia. It delivers a multimodal neurobehavioral intervention, so it uses multiple mechanisms of action, which are then focused on specific domains or symptomatology, such as voices, mood, thoughts, medication, and sleep. It is used in combination with atypical antipsychotics and with the goal to improve positive symptoms, or the endpoint PANSS. There have been 3 completed studies to date involving over 1,000 patients. It's demonstrated preliminary efficacy and real-world engagement, and we are working on multiple studies, including a large RCT in collaboration with Novartis in the second half of this year, and a pivotal targeting 2020. We've already met with the FDA to define the regulatory pathway and to disseminate this ultimately upon generating data that could support market authorization by the FDA. And this is just some of the summary of that data in patients with schizophrenia. So interestingly, we find that patients with schizophrenia have a large component of technophilia, very similar to, say, patients with autism, and they really enjoy working with mobile devices and interacting with Thrive. We found not only an improvement in efficacy in the PANSS total score as well as the Beck Depression Inventory, but we found really high levels of engagement for patients extending all the way to 24 weeks of use. So this is a therapeutic that not only improves outcomes, but that patients find it's worth using over and over again over long-term chronic duration. We also have an early discovery program for patients with multiple sclerosis. This is also in collaboration with Novartis, and we are developing therapeutics targeting symptoms of patients with MS, such as depressive symptoms, fatigue, cognition. We've been conducting product design and evidence-based therapeutic or clinical content targeting the specific biology of these symptoms of patients with MS. And we anticipate clinical trials initiating in 2019. And then we also have a therapeutic called Recall, which provides virtual reality exposure therapy, or VRET, to treat patients with post-traumatic stress disorder. This therapeutic is designed for patients with combat-induced PTSD. It's been developed in collaboration with grants from the NIH, DoD, and DARPA, and has shown efficacy in trials in over 800 patients in total. And in a study of 25 patients with chronic PTSD, we are able to show improvement in outcomes, as well as secondary outcomes such as the Beck Depression Inventory. And let's just talk finally about discovery and platform. So one, as we're developing these therapeutics, Pear recognized that as we're trying to go after multiple indications, there's only so much that any one organization can do. We need to collaborate. And one great example of that is the public-private partnership aspect of many of our early therapeutics. So many of these early therapeutics were developed in collaboration with academics and investigators, supported by funding from federal agencies. And then from the private side, organizations like Pear have further supported the development, the funding of studies, and review and submission by the FDA. And so I think it's a really exciting example of how all the important work that's being done by researchers at federal agencies, academic institutions supported by grant dollars, and then by private funding can lead to bringing these new types of products to patients. And similarly, then we've found that working with organizations like Novartis can support us in disseminating these therapeutics to patients, because there's many patients, and the ability to reach them and help to support their providers in providing access is expanded through the use of important partnerships. So as we look to develop new therapeutics, one of the advantages of prescription digital therapeutics is that we can develop a content library, just very much like a medication or drug library, where you take aspects of molecules or candidates of different types of drugs, and you have data and characteristics about those and how they interact with different biology. And so as we're developing new products targeting different symptomatology in different behavioral health diseases, we're able to build this content library, which will support more rapid iteration and development of future products targeting different disease areas. Second is that all of the software that we build is coded under good manufacturing practices, which is in compliance with the quality management system requirements of the FDA. So just like any insulin pump or implantable defibrillator, which has requirements around how the software is coded to make sure it holds up to appropriate manufacturing standards, all of our software is coded under these requirements. We've built a modular infrastructure to allow us to more rapidly build new therapeutics. Everything is HIPAA compliant. And then we have worked to make dissemination of these therapeutics more readily available. As part of our work here, the FDA actually invited Pear to be part of the pre-certification program to support developing the digital health regulatory framework of the future. And then also, because the unique aspect of all these therapeutics being software, we're able to do analytics on them to better have insight into patients, to support clinician decision-making, to support reimbursement from payers, and to optimize and make these products better. So none of these products are static. And this schematic just gives an example of both the different therapeutic modalities we can bring to bear. So not just CBT, but many forms of neurobehavioral modification. We can also take data from phone and sensors, and we can use that to ultimately optimize medication as well. And so we can target disease areas across the human organism. And we've started in neuropsychiatry, psychiatry, neurology, but intend to help to bring important therapeutics to areas of unmet needs for many patients. So our goal primarily is always focused on the patient. When anyone comes and starts at Pear, it is critically important that they understand that everything starts and ends with the patient, that if we are not focused on ultimately having an impact on providing improvement in treatment outcomes that are both safe and ultimately efficacious, that efficacy supported by data, then we're not staying aligned with our mission. And so that is what brings people to Pear and what makes unique aspect of people working at Pear, and why I'm very excited to be part of bringing this new treatment modality in collaboration with many important partners, academics, organizations like SAMHSA, and organizations who are helping to ultimately disseminate these to patients. So I really appreciate everyone's time, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Dr. Marisich, I believe you have one more slide. If you want it, there you go. Advance it one more.
There we go. This just shows the flow through our process. I think mostly spoken through this, so thank you, Angie.
Great, thank you very much. If you have questions regarding Pear Therapeutics and their prescription digital therapeutics, please contact the appropriate people via their email addresses shown here. Remember, this PowerPoint presentation will be made available to attendees after our presentation today.
Pretty good. How about you?
If you have technical questions about SAMHSA's health IT efforts, please send an email to samhsa.hit@samhsa.hhs.gov. At this point, I will facilitate questions that have come in during our presentation, and I will facilitate those, and Dr. Marisich will take a few moments and answer your questions. So Dr. Marisich, we do have several questions here. Let's see, the first one, I work for an agency that works solely with the Medicaid population. Has there been any work with low-income Medicaid populations with these technologies? That's the first part, it's a two-part question. And if so, was there any specific differences in the population's use of such technologies? For example, lack of cell phone, limited minutes on the cell, etc.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'll take both parts. So one is from a reimbursement standpoint, we are working with multiple states and their Medicaid plans and programs to help to provide access there. So that is something that is ongoing work, but is something that's important. And then there's been many states that have been very advanced in trying to identify new innovations with PDTs as being one of them. In terms of the patient population, so, and we didn't have a demographic slide there, but if you look at the publications, and we have several more publications forthcoming, there was a very broad demographic in terms of socioeconomic status, in terms of education. Patients, in order to use Reset or Reset-O, do have to be able to have a baseline level of literacy, so roughly 7th grade, but they can also listen to audio. So in terms of actually using Reset or Reset-O, we found that there's pretty broad ability as long as the patient's able to read 7th grade level or above. In terms of phone use, interestingly, we found that more and more patients, even with very low socioeconomic status, if they have anything, they have a phone. For patients with substance use disorder, this is often the one way that they get access to using their substances of abuse. And so it's one of the few things that they will keep with them. We've done implementation studies and pilots with organizations that are focused on really low socioeconomic and disadvantaged patient populations. So some of those serve patients that are typically served by like Mass Health, who will actually go and meet with patients because just getting them to a clinic is very difficult. And what they found is that a prescription digital therapeutic is key because they can provide the patient with the therapeutic They can, if necessary, provide a mobile device at times, although I'd say majority, close to 85 to 90% already had mobile devices, but the cost effectiveness of giving these devices and a data plan is really minimal compared to the overall cost of care. And then the patients will use them and use it as a way of showing their ongoing progress and providing information to the clinician, who will even meet with the patient in residential houses, at restaurants, or other community centers. So regardless of different types of care models, we think it's something that actually gives more flexibility and freedom, and that's what we've learned from many providers who are serving Medicaid populations. It's a great question.
Great, thank you. Let's see, you did talk quite a bit about some payment reimbursement issues. I have a question here, and maybe you've answered this to this individual's ability, but let's just see it real quick. You mentioned payment reimbursement through medical or pharmacy benefit and delivery via pharmacies as one option. Has this actually been done, claim and dispense with a pharmacy? There will be factors to consider for e-prescribing and claims processing.
Yeah, it's a great question. So our patient services center was just stood up, and we are actively starting to put dispensement and fulfillment through the patient services center. So there's a number of implementation and integration projects that we've done there, and so we're seeing that flow through. As we continue to work with more and more organizations and more patients and providers, we'll continue to refine that. But it's something where we have a strong belief that by working with providers and providing access while we work on the back end with payers, we can more immediately get access of a therapeutic like Reset and Reset Out to patients, and then continue to work with payers in parallel. So hopefully that's a helpful response.
Great, thank you very much. How long does it take to register a patient at the hub? This has been an access issue with specialty pharmacy pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, it's a great question. So typically it's a simple enrollment form that's completed either online or can be faxed. And so the amount of information that's needed is pretty minimal, because there are no hard aspects to fulfilling the product. Both the timeline to complete, say, an enrollment form is typically in the 10 to 20 minute range maximum, and then fulfillment can occur very quickly, because again, there's no tangible aspect to that fulfillment. It's just an access code that can come back, and so patients can be prescribed, the enrollment form can be submitted, and the patient can have dispense and fulfillment all while in the clinician's or clinical office.
Great, thank you. For diagnoses like insomnia, where a medication may not be prescribed, is there an opportunity for the patient to access the application solution without needing a prescription?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, you know, Pear's approach is that as we develop any of these therapeutics, that while we're initially focusing on more serious and severe diseases, so if you notice, like for Pear 003, these patients were actually pretty sick. They had chronic insomnia on average of 9 years, and also had to have depressive symptoms as well. And there was actually a large amount of suicidal ideation in this patient population. So for that type of patient population, there was obviously a lot of scrutiny that an organization like, and regulators like the FDA need to bring to bear on the data to determine it's safe, and to make sure that they're getting the appropriate level of clinical supervision. However, for digital therapeutics in general, there may be patient populations that do lend themselves to over-the-counter or OTC use. And the interesting thing to always consider is that for any over-the-counter or OTC product, say like Tylenol or ibuprofen, those products tend to have been studied even more rigorously in multiple clinical trials to make sure that there is safety for the patient and appropriate instructions to guide the patient into how to use. So definitely would not rule out that in the future we may have over-the-counter digital therapeutics, but it will be need, just like any other medication, to be very thoughtful in terms of, is it something that the patient can use? What is the severity of illness, and how do we protect the patient and make sure that they're getting appropriate clinical care as well? It's a great question.
Great, thank you. Are the Pear apps marked on FHIR enabled?
I might be able to speculate as to what smart on FHIR enabled, but I'm honestly not exactly sure. So if there's any clarification, happy to try and take that one.
Okay, all right, let's go on to the next question. Does the information flow directly into a provider EHR, or do they have to log onto your system to see the results? And is there a cost associated with providers using your system?
Yes, good question. So there's no cost to the provider. So a provider who signs up, and we actually have a certification program as well, then they can get access to the dashboard and prescribe to patients. In terms of connecting with EHRs, so we are actively working with multiple EHR vendors to integrate into that. And in the intermediate period, we're working on the ability for a clinician to pull data from the dashboard into their note. So I think it's really important, and as probably many providers as part of this event are aware, that oftentimes the limitations or the rate of having that occur is based on the EHR company. But it's something that we've heard is and recognize is universally important, and so it's an important part of our process.
Okay, great, thank you. And I'm getting lots of clarity on the question, so let's try this one more time. Are the Pear apps marked on FHIR enabled?
I'm sorry, on FHIR enabled?
Information Exchange Standard.
Okay. So I'm not 100% sure on that, so I wouldn't want to speculate on that. So for clarity, I can just say, so the way that the Pear software applications are built, they're built on a good manufacturing based or 21 CFR 820 compliant modular infrastructure. They are HIPAA compliant, and then they are submitted to both the Google Play and the Apple app or iOS store. When they're downloaded, a prescription access code is provided to the patient upon receiving the prescription, and they're inputted to provide access. So that's the kind of high level background that I can provide about the apps, and I apologize if I'm not familiar with FHIR.
Okay, great, thank you. Let's see, I think we have time for one more question. I've got about 4 more here, but unfortunately we'll be able to get to one more. Let's see, how does Reset interface with the testing centers?
Maybe a little more context on the testing center. In terms of the clinical trial sites, I can be happy to speak to that if that's what was meant by testing center.
Okay, I'm not sure, unfortunately. I don't have much more clarity than that. Let's go one more question here.
To the clinical trial sites real quick, then okay. Is that the
sure,
clinical trial sites. So for example, in the Reset study, the clinical trial sites were all run through NIDA clinical trial centers. And so these are centers or sites that have to meet a certain level of threshold to participate in NIDA clinical trial studies. And so these sites are, and in the Reset study, were actually community treatment programs. So the majority of them are used to providing many different kinds of care, and they had clinicians with varying levels of expertise and experience. And so the reason for that design in those community treatment programs was to try and replicate real world usage as much as possible.
Great, thank you very much. Hopefully that clarifies and answers the question to the participant satisfaction. I think at this time, Dr. Marisich, we're going to have to stop here. We're getting close to the top of the hour. Thank you very much for your time today, Dr. Marisich, and to everybody who has participated. On behalf of SAMHSA, I would like to thank you for being here and for listening to our presentation today. Today's webinar is a part of a series of behavioral health IT webinars. To view recordings of past behavioral health IT webinars, go to the SAMHSA website, click the YouTube icon, and select the Behavioral Health IT Webinar Series playlist. Also, please note that you will receive an email asking you to participate in a brief survey about your reaction to the webinar. I would also like to extend an invitation to you, and you will be receiving a follow-up email with the slides this afternoon from our staff. I'd like to invite you to participate in a webinar tomorrow, July 12th, titled Building a Roadmap for Success, Part 2. This webinar will include about 30 minutes of a discussion from Ray Tomasi from Gosnold on the Cape, who will be discussing the use of Pear Therapeutics from the provider's perspective, a nice complement to Dr. Marisich's presentation today. The link to register for that webinar will be sent to you this afternoon, so keep an eye out for that, and you will be able to hear from a provider perspective in the use of this very fascinating and interesting technology. Again, on behalf of SAMHSA, thank you very much for being a part of our webinar today, and I look forward to hearing from you on a future webinar. Thank you.